Good evening, gentlemen.
I'm taking too long in notes on it.
Last week we began chapter 6. With God's help, we began chapter 6 of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. Chapter 6 is the culmination. It's the culmination. It's where everything comes together from the previous 5 chapters. God constantly speaks the world into being. Therefore, the world is nothing but the force which creates it. Therefore, there must be a divine power which conceals godliness from us, because otherwise why do we not perceive godliness? But since this power does not make the world disappear, but only conceals the godliness from us, right? Since this power is not just a subtractive shield which diminishes the rays of the sun, since this power is what makes the world have different levels of holiness, there's things which are closer to and further away from God, this power must not be a separate power. It must not be a separate act of creation, that God has a Shem Havaya, which we call his act of revelation and creation, and a name of Elohim, which then conceals, but these two must work together. The creation of the world is in one act. It is not that Havaya creates and then Elohim conceals. The creation itself is an act of concealment. This is what we've learned basically up until chapter 5. Last week, we continued our discussion of Shem Elohim. We discussed how Elohim is nature, is gematria hateva, right? That this Shem Elohim is nature, and that nature is what conceals over the presence of God. And we went into all the different definitions of nature in Judaism. That nature has to do with repetition, it has to do with the mold, the repeating of forms, right? Concealment, tubu b'yamsuf, right? That the water conceals what is submerged in it, right? Anything, we said that nature is anything for which there's no explanation, right? In Alter Rebbe's famous definition, why does the bird fly? Because that's its nature, right? And all of these things are connected, and all of these things conceal the fact that everything is totally united with godliness. This is the divine power of Elohim. The divine power of Elohim prevents us from seeing that nothing has an independent reality. There is no bird as an independent reality. There is only godliness which expresses itself as a bird, and that's the true answer to the question, why does a bird fly? The answer is because that's the way God is constantly speaking it into existence, that it should be a flying creature, right? And so to all such questions. Nature conceals God. Shem Elohim is the thing's nature, that the thing is an independent reality and even has a nature, has a form, has a consistency. All of these things are what allow us to not to see God within the thing, not to see godliness within this reality. And it's the tzimtzum, the contraction of the divine revelation, the self-concealment, the koyach of gvura, right, the power of gvura, severity, also known as Shem Elohim, which allows this to happen. Then the Alter Rebbe says something different. The Alter Rebbe says something totally out of left field. We read it last week and we began to explain it, but we didn't really get into it. So this week we're going to get into it. The Alter Rebbe says as follows. We read this last week, we may as well read it again now. It's on page, in the English, it is 895. In the Hebrew, it is V'harei b'chinas gvura zu. In the Hebrew. The Alter Rebbe says, V'harei b'chinas gvura zu, page 895. This gvura, this divine severity, this divine self-concealment, the tzimtzum, this contraction of the godly light, hazeh, hu gam kein b'chinas chesed, is also a divine kindness, sheha'olam yivonavoi, that the world is built on this kindness. V'zuhi b'chinas gvura hakalula b'chesed. This is the gvura, the divine gvura, which is included within chesed, which is inter-included. It's hiskalalus. They are inter-included one from the other, right? This fact that we always bring up every year at Tzviras HaOmer, which we mentioned last week as well, the end of last week's class, which we'll review what we spoke about at the end of last week's class in a moment. But we always bring up that there's not just Gvura and Chesed, there's also Chesed Sheba Gvura and Gvura Sheba Chesed, right? It's not just God's kindness. It's not like God's kindness is pure kindness. His kindness also has an aspect of severity and of all the other 8 modes of divine expression that we call the Spheros. And so too, his severity is not pure severity. His severity includes within it kindness. There's a kindness within severity, as we'll discuss more this week, God willing. So we said we need to understand this. And to understand this, we had a discussion at the end of last week's class that will hopefully lay the groundwork and make this week's class easier. And what our discussion was about is fundamentally that when we learn Chassidus, and when we learn the Kabbalah that's contained within Chassidus, we have to realize that the things that we're discussing, God's kindness, right, God's chesed, or God's severity, God's self-withholding, his self-concealment in Gvura. Each of these things we have to be mafshit hadvarim megash miyusam. We have to abstract these concepts away from their physicality. Right? In other words, when we speak of the divine severity, we are not talking about an object that exists in a certain space. Even in a certain spiritual space, it doesn't exist. We're talking about a whole general mode of divine expression. As I went into last week, there's Gvura at every level, right? There's Gvura in the vessels. There's Gvura in the light. There's Gvura before the Tzimtzum. There's Gvura after the Tzimtzum. There's Gvura as we perceive it in our world, right? Which is different than Gvura as it's perceived above. There's all sorts of different things. Each one of these terms exists at multiple levels. It's not, as I tried to say last week, it's not like one piece of cloth and another piece of cloth. Gvura and Chesed are threads with which everything is woven. Right? And even the Gvura garment in Atzilus, as we just mentioned, right? Even the Gvura garment, even the actual thing or the act, however you want to look at it, right? Or the light that we call God's severity, even that is made with 10 threads. One of the threads of that is kindness, right? In other words, we have to think a little bit more abstractly, a little bit more open-mindedly. These are not specific realities that are confined to one realm or one area of effect, so to speak, right? That you can put them in a box and say it's defined, and here it is. When we speak of these fundamental Kabbalistic concepts, especially the ones that are denoted by the Spheros, right? The Spheros are not really self-contained modes in any one place, right? They are, so to speak, the 10 themes of the story of the entire creation. There are spheros before what we call spheros. There are spheros after what we call spheros. There's lower expressions. There's higher expressions. At every step of the process of creation with which Kabbalah is so deeply concerned and which we keep talking about, right? There's these things are recurring in different forms and in different ways. And part of the whole wisdom of the Kabbalah is trying to piece apart and understand how this is possible, how each of these things is recurring and applies at different levels and in different ways. Yes? So with that in mind, we can begin to understand why it is that the Alter Rebbe says what he says here, and what it is that he says. Why does the Alter Rebbe say, what the Alter Rebbe says here at the simple level, right, is that the Gvura is really not Gvura, right? The Alter Rebbe says, Bechinas Gvura zu v'tzimtzum hazeh hu gam kein bechinas chesed. This Gvura, what we are calling the divine self-concealment, is also chesed, the divine revelation. In other words, these two concepts, which we have been speaking about under two different names, right, are not really two separate concepts. Really, this Gvura, this divine self-concealment, is also a divine expression, is also a divine kindness.
But he's talking about this specific
Why
Gvura
is
in this context, no?
Why is the Alter Rebbe saying this here, L'chaim? There's other Gvura, it's not for now. Why is the Alter Rebbe saying this? Why is the Alter Rebbe saying this here? Why is the Alter Rebbe now bringing up the concept of Gvura and Chesed. In other words, not the general why. The general why is that the Alter Rebbe is working towards his conclusions in the first 6 chapters of here in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, and we'll see that he's bringing everything full circle to the beginning. That's also true. But in the intellectual hisbonenus, right? If we were actually contemplating Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, right? In other words, if we're sitting there in davening, which is, remember, the entire point of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah is to come to a love of God. That's the entire point of this part of Tanya, right? So if we're sitting and contemplating everything that the Alter Rebbe has said, right? Our contemplation follows a certain order, right? First, we think about the Baal Shem Tov and what it says in the Midrash about God creating the world every moment, right? And then about the nature of the world as being totally batal and nullified within God's light. And then we think about how there's also Shem Elikim and a Tzimtzum, which is concealing his presence from me constantly. Even though everything is totally nullified to his light, I'm not able to see it because the way that it's created is in a way of Tzimtzum, right? The Havaya is revealed with Elikim, light in a vessel, as we discussed at great length. Right? When you think about this to yourself, you'll come to a question. And that's why the Alter Rebbe is changing his topic here. What's the question that you'll come to? What's the question that you'll come to? The question you'll come to is as follows. I know from what we said in chapter 4 and continued at the beginning of this chapter, here at chapter 6, that the divine Gevura, the divine power of self-concealment, is as infinite, you remember this from chapter 4? It is as infinite, as powerful, and as inexplicable, impossible to understand, as God's kindness. This should ring a bell. Remember this from chapter 4? We discussed this, at least 2 classes, yes? That God's self-concealment is just as infinite, just as godly, and just as impossible to understand as his revelation, yes? So I understand up until here in chapter 6 that he has both of these powers. Right? And we explained in chapter 4, how does it express that the divine kindness is infinite? Anyone remember? How does it express that the divine kindness, the divine power of creation is actually infinite? How is that? How do we know it's infinite?
Because the world exists.
Not just that it exists, but that it exists
Every moment.
every moment, but also?
We don't.
No. It exists, but every moment how?
Being created.
Being created, something
By
from
speech.
nothing. By speech,
okay.
something from nothing, right? That only an infinite power can create something from nothing.
Actually, I heard something very interesting today about that. I mean, there are like 2 paths of creating this world. I mean, the neshamot, and which are the spiritual things, and the physical. So the physical, in one way, can be more holy than the Or and Sof. Why? Because the Or and Sof is going through levels and it comes to transfer. Even though, although the physical world was created actually by words directly coming from God. So it's like, one hand it's going through steps, and the other one is like created just directly by God's word.
That's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that the world, right, the physical reality which exists something from nothing can only be created by God the infinite himself, right? That's how we know that it's God's kindness which is creating the world. It's not just some other kindness or some other force. It must be God's, because only the truly infinite can create something from nothing, right? And there's other ways as well. We explained that the divine kindness doesn't just create one thing, something from nothing. It creates an infinite number of things, something from nothing, right? Because our world is full of an infinite number of different things. There's an infinite number of angels. That God's divine kindness is truly expressed infinitely. He doesn't just create one thing, something from nothing, which itself is an expression of the infinite, but he creates an infinite number of things in an infinite way, right? As we explained. So God's kindness, we discussed how it's infinite. Right? So if you're contemplating this and you're trying to contemplate how God's self-concealment is also infinite, right? It's as infinite as God's kindness, right? What problem do you run into? What problem do you run into? The problem you run into is that God's self-concealment does not seem to be so infinite. It doesn't seem to be as infinite. Why? Why does it not seem to be as infinite? Because if God's self-concealment was truly infinite, right, then it shouldn't express in a piecemeal, so to speak, It shouldn't express on a spectrum. That's the best way to put it. It shouldn't express on a spectrum, right? Think back to what we're saying. We're saying, remember, that the diversity within creation, right? The fact that the cup is different than the table, which is different than a human being, which is different than a frog, which is different than an angel in the world of Bria, right? All of these things are different. The reason why they're different is because there's one infinite divine power of creation. The one infinite divine power of creation, there's no room for diversity. It's one and infinite, right? Where does the diversity come from? The diversity in creation comes from Shem Elokim, from his self-concealment, right? That we say that he conceals himself a little more here, and he creates something that's less holy, less godly. He conceals himself a little less here, and you have a creation which is more divine, which more obviously expresses a godliness at all sorts of different levels. And when you take into account that it's not just a reduction in the light, but it's actually lending qualities to the light, as we spoke about at the end of chapter 4, that it's not just a reduction, but it actually lends forms to the light, right? It lends qualities. It doesn't, or as we would have put it in our metaphor from chapter 4, it doesn't just conceal the true color of the water, it also makes the water appear red, right? It lends qualities, it lends forms, it lends natures to things, right? Elokim is nature. It lends natures to things. You realize that this is what allows there to be an infinite number of things in the world, an infinite number of creations, an infinite number of levels, right? An infinite number of angels, creatures, worlds, right? The question is, where does this diversity come from, right? This seems to be a contradiction. We say you can't get diversity from Shem Havaya. Why? Because it's truly infinite and one with God. Right? So where must the diversity be pushed off to? Shem Elokim. However, what are we saying about Shem Elokim? It's absolutely infinite and one with God. Right? Shem Elokim is as infinite and as godly, right? So what should really happen? What should theoretically happen? What should theoretically happen if Shem Elokim is equally as godly as Shem Havaya? If the divine concealment is as infinite as the divine revelation, what should happen? There should be a divine creation, which creates the thing, and a divine concealment which totally conceals that godliness, and everything should exist the same at one level, right? There shouldn't be a diversity of levels, a diversity of worlds, right? Everything should exist at the same level. And that same level would be a level where the godliness is concealed, right? By the infinite power of his self-concealment. How is it that there's all different levels, diversity, all different types of things, some holy, less holy? Where does the diversity of Elokim come from? Elokim has to be just as one with God as Shem Havaya, as we discussed in the previous chapter, right? It's just as infinite. If a true infinity, it must be simple. If a true infinity must not have parts, right? And then just as the divine revelation, the divine power of creation has no parts and no room for diversity, where's the room for diversity in the divine concealment? It's also infinite. God's infinite power of concealment, right? Just as God, through no process, because he's infinite, right? There's no process, as we discussed once. He can, so to speak, snap the divine fingers and things pop into existence, right? With Shem Havaya, the divine kindness, so too should he snap his fingers and he should be totally concealed within those things. Not a process where almost as Eyal was saying, where there's different spheros and there's different things, there's different levels. Some angels some angels are higher, some angels are lower. Then you have the physical world, which is lowest of all. Where does this diversity come from? If Shem Elokim is absolutely one with God, that's the question. That's the question.
So what's the reason for Shem Elokim?
The reason for Shem Elokim is to conceal God's presence. That's the reason for Shem
If you didn't
Elokim.
have it,
Then he would be totally revealed. There would be no independent reality apart from God.
physical world then.
No independent reality
be
apart from
spiritual.
God. No, it could be
It'll
physical.
be God, which is what happens now as well.
It could be
That's what
physical.
the reason is like, it is what it is. It's like,
It could be, the world could be physical. I don't know about physical, but the world would have absolutely no independent reality from God whatsoever, even in its own perception. There would just be godliness, and everything would be aware that it was only godliness. That's what it would be. That's what it would be. The world would have no independent perception of independence from God. Why is a perception of independence from God important? That's $1 billion question. It's $1 billion question. Question for a different time. Apparently it's important to God. It's important to God that there should be something that perceives itself as independent from him. That's all I can, that's pretty much all I know about it, almost.
God's hard to get.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. So,
Yeah.
He's essentially hard to get. The answer of the Alter Rebbe, does everyone understand the question, right? The question put in a slightly different way, right? The question put in a slightly different way is that the Gvura itself needs a Gvura, right? The divine concealment itself needs a concealment, if you understand what I'm saying, right? In other words, the infinite divine revelation is split into a world of multiplicity, into many different levels, many different realities by the divine power of concealment. That's what adds this diversity. But the power of concealment itself doesn't have it to give, right? It itself is just as infinite, just as simple. Yes? So the Gvura itself needs a Gvura, right? It's like who watches the Watchmen, right? The limitation, the limiting force itself needs a limiting force, right? Otherwise, it's hard to see how we get all these different levels, all these different beings, all these different forms, right? Where does that come from? And the Alter Rebbe answers this question in a radical way. A radical way, makes a radical statement. The radical statement is that the Gvura is really the Gvura of Chesed. Or to translate, his self-concealment is really not self-concealment. His self-concealment is really a form of self-revelation. What does this mean, and how does it answer the question? As we explained at the end of chapter 4, the world is created by a divine revelation and a divine self-concealment in one act, right? The two of them act together. It's not like there's a separate power which conceals God after he reveals himself, right? It's that the world is created what we were calling the dark light, the Butzina de Kardunisa. There's a revelation that is itself concealment, right? And we said this is the thing that it's impossible to understand.
Concealed power.
Only concealed power. Concealed, see. It's concealed power. The very act of divine creation, which is an expression of the fact that nothing is separate from him. The very process from which nothing can possibly be separate itself is what creates this appearance of separateness, right? That's basically what we said at the end of chapter 4, right? It's v'kli. It's not two separate things. Or a different way of putting it is, if you see the image of the red cup with the water in it, right, you don't get two separate things. You don't get a picture of the water and then the water that's made red by the cup, right? You get only one picture. The picture comes as one. Yes? There's a red cup with water in it. That's what you see. That's what you see. The two things come as one. The very vision which is telling you there is water is the very same vision which is telling you the water's red. There's no separation. You get only one vision. The only point at which the water has no color is in the water's relationship to itself, right? As we explained before. The water in itself, right? The water knows that the water is clear. Right? Which is why we say that everything really is ultimately one with godliness, right? There is only clear water. The water knows that there is only clear water, right? But the water, as it expresses through Shem Elokim, the water and Elokim together, the water and the red cup, as they express together, give the illusion of red water, right? They give the perception of red water. And it's really only by the water's participation, as we explained at great length, right? It's not like it's the cup is lying and lying about the water. The cup is conveying the water. They work together. If there was no water, there could also be no red water, in other words, right? You remember all this. We've been over this. So, what we're saying here is really a different way of stating the same point. It's really the same point again, right? In fact, it's kind of the conclusion. It's the conclusion of that idea. We're saying a step further. This idea that we said at the end of chapter 4, that Shem Elokim and Shem Havaya are not two separate powers, but are two powers that act in one act, right? They express together. It's not Havaya and then Elokim conceals it, but rather it's Havaya acting through Shem Elokim, right? Just like the divine speech, we said, is not the divine breath and then words are added to it, right? The divine breath acts through the letters. It acts through the pronunciation of the words, right? The letters being Shem Elokim and the breath being Shem Havaya, right? It was a different metaphor. They work together. They work as one. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying, if that is the case, if they really do work as one, right, then the Gvura is not really Gvura. The Gvura is not pure Gvura. The self-concealment, the divine self-concealment is not really a self-concealment. Why? Because this is a self-concealment as part of the act of self-revelation. Again, it is a self-concealment as part of the act of self-revelation.
It
right?
allows the revelation.
In other words, okay.
No?
I don't know what you said. In other words, the divine revelation, which is expressed in a limited form as one act, the limitation is part of the revelation. For example, you have a few examples. First of all, you have we went over the water in the colored glass already. You also have the teacher that teaches the student, right? A very famous example. If you have a teacher who's very, very knowledgeable on a certain subject, and he has to teach a student who is not as knowledgeable, right? The teacher has to limit his own knowledge to be able to teach at the student's level, right? Now, when the teacher limits his own knowledge, what I mean by that is that the teacher does not tell the student everything he knows, right? If Einstein is teaching a high school freshman physics class, right, he doesn't say everything that he knows about the Newtonian mechanics and how it's really false because general relativity is true, right, and there's no real such thing as a force of gravity and the mechanics don't apply in every astronomical case, etc., 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 right? Einstein would not do that with the freshmen in high school. It wouldn't be wise anyway if he was a good teacher. Einstein instead would teach them at their level. So you could say, well, Einstein is concealing himself. As part of the act of teaching, Einstein is hiding himself, right? But the point the Alter Rebbe is making here is that that's not really a concealment. It's not really a concealment. It's a concealment as part of the act of revelation. What's the real concealment? The real concealment is Einstein says nothing. That's the real concealment. The true gvura, right? The true gvura is that there's no godliness expressed here at all. Right? This gvura that we're describing, this is why our discussion from last week of how gvura means different things at different levels, right? And it's not any one thing, but is rather a mode of divine expression, right? So we're saying the same thing here. We're saying the same thing here, that the gvura is an expression. The gvura is an active expression. It's not gvura alone. It's gvura as part of the teacher revealing himself. What's a different example of gvura that's chesed? A famous one from Chassidus. Any volunteers? Famous example from Chassidus of gvura that's actually chesed. It's almost the most obvious example in a way. What's the famous example from Chassidus? Any volunteers?
Mashal Azona?
No. Everyone's favorite, but not a mashal. No, not what I'm looking for. Nope. It's the only one we can remember, right? It's the only memorable one. What's the metaphor? The metaphor is from a father to a son, right? The obvious metaphor. Yeah? A father disciplines a child, right? A parent disciplines a child. Right. Yeah? The parent disciplines the child sees gvura. Right? What does the parent know? The parent knows that what would be the real gvura, the real severity, the real self-concealment of the parent, the real withholding of the parent would be to not be involved at all. Right? Which is the famous example. What, you don't want me to tell you? Right? So how many times has a Jewish parent said that? You don't want me to discipline you? You don't want me to be involved? Right? The greatest punishment is the non-involvement. Right? But when you discipline your child for doing something wrong, right? So even some mashpiyim like to give the example. I'm not sure if it's from Chassidus itself or it's just a Chassidus teacher example. But the example is if your child is playing with a knife and you take the knife away from them, right? It's severity, right? It's a concealment of your love for your child because the pure love would theoretically let them do everything, right? The person you truly love, they can do anything. It's a concealment. It's a gvura. It's a form of severity, and yet, what is it really? It's really part of love. It's an expression of love, right? It's the butzina de kardunisa. It's the dark light. You're expressing love, but you're expressing love through severity. Yes? It's a relatively mundane idea. In the metaphor, a relatively mundane idea. Here, as we're going to discuss, here as we're applying it, it's not so mundane. It's not so mundane at all, as we will explain presently. So the question, let's just answer the question at the simple level, and then we'll go deeper. The answer to the question at the simple level, the question you'll recall is what acts as the gvura to gvura, right? If gvura is really infinite, right, what gives it multiplicity? How does it get into all of these different expressions, right? All these different elements, divisions, the multiplicity of creation. How does that arise from Gvura? And the answer is that Gvura does not need limitation. The Gvura does not need limitation. The whole idea that the Gvura would be infinite, right, in the truest sense, in the highest sense, that it would be absolutely simple, that it would absolutely conceal God in the same way everywhere, right? The assumption is false. This Gvura is not the pure infinite Gvura, which would limit everything. This Gvura is Gvura that is part of Chesed, and the Chesed is part of Gvura. That's the answer at the simple level. The answer to the question at the simple level is that this Gvura is not the infinite Gvura that we had in our question. It's a different type of Gvura. It's not the infinite Gvura which would limit God's expression at every level, right? It is the Gvura that is part of kindness. It's the Gvura that is part of kindness. What does this mean? What does this mean? Let's answer at a deeper level, right? Let's read further in the Alter Rebbe, because the Alter Rebbe brings up the reason that we have to understand this in a deeper way. Top of page 897. 897 in the English. Top of the page. Top of page 897. V'hinei. From the inclusion of each of these traits, one in the other, right? That this is the fact that this is a gvura of chesed. Nira la'ayin, we see with our eyes. It is apparent to our eyes. De'ihu v'garmuhi chad, that he and his causations, he and his attributes, shehein midosav, which are his attributes, are one. Since they are totally united with him, they are therefore united one with the other and include one with the other. The Alter Rebbe says that from the fact that Gvura is a Gvura of Chesed, we can see that he and his attributes are one. Right? The Alter Rebbe is saying something incredibly counterintuitive. He's saying something counterintuitive. Why? In our question about Gvura, in our question about the divine self-concealment, right, we say that if it's truly infinite, right, if it's truly godly, then we shouldn't have diversity in the world because it's only one Gvura. Yes? That was the question. So if the diversity comes from Gvura, where does the diversity in the Gvura come from, right? If it's godly, then it wouldn't have divisions, right? It would be truly infinite in that way. The Alter Rebbe here is saying the exact opposite. The Alter Rebbe is saying, because it is a Gvura of Chesed, Because Gevura and Chesed are united, that is how we see that it's godly. In other words, because it's not the infinite Gevura in our initial understanding, right? It's not that type of infinite Gevura. It's rather a Gevura which is limited by Chesed. It's a Gevura which is part of Chesed. I'm going to explain this more in a second, so if this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. Because it is not an infinite self-limitation, therefore, specifically, we see that it must be godly. It must be united with God. It's because the Chesed and Gevura are not absolute, but are rather inter-included. They're beskalulus. They're interleaved one with the other, right? They're mixed up in this way. They're mixed one into the other. It's specifically because of this that we see that they're godly. Not because the Gevura is infinite. That's a false conception, the Alter Rebbe is saying. You're thinking incorrectly. The Alter Rebbe is correcting a misconception. The misconception is that if the divine severity, the divine self-concealment, were truly divine, we would see no difference in all the creations, no difference in forms, no difference in levels between worlds, right? The Alter Rebbe is answering, the truly divine, the truly infinite Gevura is the Gevura that's mixed with Chesed. What does this mean? What does this mean, right? To understand what this means, you can ask a different question. You ask a different question on what it says here, right? The different question is as follows. The Alter Rebbe says, because Gevura and Chesed are mixed one with the other, you can see that they're absolutely divine and absolutely godly, right? The question is, but what do you mean? I just gave you a metaphor, right? Pick your metaphor. You have teacher and student. You have the water in the colored glass, right? You have a father disciplining the son, right? You can pick whichever one you want as your favorite and follow along, right? These are all things that are within the world, where Gevura and Chesed, right, where severity and love, severity and self-revelation, right, self-revelation and self-concealment, right, where they are working together as one. The two things are not separate. They work together as one.
What is the source for all of that? I mean, I understand
For all of what?
I mean, of the integration and the separation. I understand that it's coming with some sort of explanation, but I mean, what makes it more right than other things?
What do you mean?
I mean, the fact that he's saying that actually it's combined, I mean, Chesed and Gevura, and it's like...
Which
that you just explained. So, I mean, you know, he is coming with his own interpretation.
Oh no, we're going to read it from Tikkun Ezra in a second. We're going to read. We're going to see where it says. We're going to see in Tikkun Ezra. It's in Pasach Eliyahu. We're going to say in a minute. Yeah, we just haven't got that in the text yet. We're going to see in Tikkun Ezra what he's saying. But in other words, we're saying Chesed and Gevura coming together, that's a sign of God. If you have Chesed and Gevura together, right, such that the severity is part of the act of divine expression, the severity is part of the divine kindness, as we're explaining, right? It's part of the act of creation itself, right? That means that these two traits must be divine, right? That it's the Chesed is one with God and the Gevura is one with God, right? His revelation is one with him, his self-concealment is one with him. Hang on a second. We just said that when a father is kind to his son, right, and he expresses that kindness through severity, it's kindness and severity together, right? So it seems that we have things in our world, things that are not divine traits, right? A father disciplining his son, something that happens 1,000,000 times every day here on planet Earth, right? And we're saying that this is something which is truly only in the divine attributes, basically, right? What do you mean it's only in the divine attributes? Any father disciplining his son, right? A father who never learned Kabbalah and never learned Tanya and never learned Torah and is not Jewish and doesn't even an atheist father who disciplines his son, right? An atheist father who disciplines his son seems to be combining Chesed and Gevura, right? He has a love. The love is expressed as severity. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying the fact that love and severity, right, that the divine revelation and the divine self-concealment, that revelation and self-concealment act together, this itself is the proof that it's godly. It's godly. It's something we see every day. We see it also in the water in the colored cup. We had our example, right? We had an example from the teacher and the student. If Einstein were to teach a physics class to a freshman, that would be an expression of the divine traits. It's a worldly thing. It's a regular, everyday thing, right? This fact is our key to really getting the juice out of the chapter here, getting the deeper, what's really going on here. Because the truth is that that is not the case. The truth is that achdus, which this is a general principle in Chassidus, which it's good to know, achdus, unity, true unity between opposites, is only by God, not in the world. Only by God, not in the world. What do we mean? Let's look at our examples. Right? Let's look at our examples. You have the water in the cup, right? For example, where the water is perceived as red, it's not perceived as clear, right? Listen, where the water is perceived as red, it's not perceived as clear, right? Now we understand that if the water wasn't there at all, fine, so then I understand. If the cup wasn't there at all, or the water wasn't there at all, then I wouldn't perceive red water. I understand that. I understand how the Gevura and the Chesed work together to present this image to me, that there's the divine revelation and the divine concealment, which gives it the form of redness. I understand how both of them work together, right? However, where I perceive it as red, right, I actually perceive it as red. There's no perception of clear water and red water in the same place, right? That's one metaphor. Let's put it in a different metaphor. When Einstein is concealing his knowledge from the student, right, the student actually does not receive all of Einstein's knowledge about physics, right? He actually does not receive it. Yes? Einstein knows something, and he's not revealing it. In other words, I understand that for the student to receive anything, right, Einstein must hide most of his knowledge and only reveal a little bit of it. And I understand how this act of self-concealment is really part of the act of revelation, that in order to teach this student, right, he must conceal part of his knowledge. I understand all that. But at the end of the day, what is the student getting? The student is getting a percent of a percent of a percent, a fraction of a fraction of what Einstein actually knows about physics. In other words, the intention of Einstein is to teach the student, right? The goal of Einstein is that the student should be able to understand. But what is the act? The act actually conceals. The act actually conceals, right? My intention is that the student should understand. But what does that mean? That means that I cannot authentically reveal myself. It is an act of concealment, right? It is an act literally of concealing what I really am. To put it slightly differently, right? What is revelation? What's chesed? What's kindness in this situation? In other words, we have to return to the definitions of the words, right? When we say divine kindness, right, or Einstein's self-revelation, right, or the father's love for his child, right, or the water being clear, these are all the same thing in all the different metaphors, right? Do we mean that the thing being revealed is that its authentic self is revealed as it is to itself, right? In which case, Einstein's true revelation would be him speaking all these words of physics that the student can't understand? Or do we mean that expression means that the other should be able to receive something? Again, there's two ways you could understand revelation. Einstein could be revealing himself authentically, in which case the student receives nothing. Or Einstein could be making sure that the student receives, but then in that case, what would the student receive? Not the authentic expression of Einstein, of the teacher, right? It's the same with the father and the son, by the way, right? It's the same with the father and the son. The father's intention is that the son should receive love, right? But what is the actual act itself? The actual act itself is an act of discipline, act of gvura. Right? It's an act of gvura. In other words, let me put it in a different way. The fact that this gvura, that this severity, that this self-concealment, in whichever metaphor you want, is happening in the context of revelation, right, does not mean that this self-concealment, that this gvura is actually chesed, is actually kindness, is actually self-revelation. Right? You understand? All we've done, it would seem, by using these metaphors, is say that what's the true revelation is that the receiver should receive something. That's the true revelation, right? But the truth is that all you're doing is playing with the words, right? It would seem. All you're doing is playing with the words. At the end of the day, what is the act? The act is an act of gvura. The act is an act of concealing my authentic self-revelation, right? The student is not getting everything Einstein knows. He's never even met Einstein in a way. So too, with the father disciplining the child, right? The child may be receiving, the intention of the parent is for love, but the act is an act of gvura. Right? And the truth is, as Rabbi Yoel says, that everything in Elam Hazeh, all the examples that we know of Chesed and Gvura acting together, they can only act together because each one is weakened from its position. Right? Each one is weakened. Each one doesn't hold its true position, right? In other words, as he says with the father and the son, for example, right? He says that God forbid the father, if he smacks his son, right, in an act of discipline, right, as the Torah says you should do, and that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, as it says in the book of Proverbs. Although maybe it's not for this generation. It's complicated. Oh, don't worry. I still have the scars. No, I'm joking. The God forbid to say that the father, when he strikes his child, should strike him the same way that he strikes an enemy. Right? That's clearly not the case, right? So too, the father's love for the child, which should be a legitimate love, as the Rambam explains, you can go read it in the Mishnah Torah, about how when the father disciplines the child, it should be with the feeling of true love, right? And if the father has any feeling other than love when he's disciplining the child, then it's a terrible thing and he should never do it, right? So the father's disciplining the child with a sense of true love. But is that love that the father feels at the time that he disciplines the same feeling of love as when the child is well behaved, right? Or the child is being lovable, right? Or he's hugging his child. And the answer is no, it's not. It's still love, but it's a weakened love, right? The way that the love and the discipline are able to coexist is because the love is not truly expressed and discipline is not truly expressed. If each one of them is weakened from its initial position, then the two of them can be together, right?
The question is the point of view. If you're looking from the point of view of the father or the point of view of the son.
What we're actually saying here is that it's not, though. It's not really a question of point of view. That's what we're saying. We're saying the point of view thing is a misunderstanding of what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say here. It's not a point of view thing. Even the father knows that his love when he's hitting the child, when he's disciplining the child, is not the same as the love that he has when he's hugging the child. Even the father knows, is what the Alter Rebbe is the idea here anyway. It's not just a perspective thing. Even the father knows, right? In this world, these opposites cannot be reconciled unless each one is weakened from its initial position. True opposites in their full strength cannot be reconciled. Right? This is a similar argument that, never mind, maybe we shouldn't speak. Maybe not. After the class. After the class, PS. So too in the teaching. When Einstein teaches the student, right? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. That Einstein truly wants to teach, but is it the same feeling of teaching that he gets when he teaches to someone who can truly understand him in his genius, right? And on the other hand, he's limiting himself. But is it the ultimate self-limitation? No, it's not. It's not the true self-limitation of his thought. The true self-limitation of his thought, right, would be not to reveal anything or reveal it even lower, right? It's weakened. The way that the things come together in this world, the opposites come together, is only if each one is weakened from its position, right? This is what's called compromise, right? In this world, opposites come together by compromise. Yes?
What you're saying there, in effect, is Einstein can never pass on all his knowledge.
That's correct. That's correct.
We can never progress.
I don't know if it means we can never progress. It means that no one can ever know a person as they know themselves. That's not just true of Einstein, that's true of everyone. So what does this mean? In this world, opposites only come together by each one being weakened, right? Which is why when we understand what it means that God creates with chesed and gvura in one act which has both chesed and gvura, we know that these traits are divine. These traits are godly. These traits are not from the world. Because what is it again? What's the act that we're discussing, right? God, in the very same act by which he brings the thing into being from something into nothing, which remember, is not an act of separate creation. When God brings into being something from something into nothing, he does not create it as something separate. It's created as part of him, as everything which is created something from nothing must be, remember. right? This act of creation, he makes the thing, right? When God makes a frog or an elephant, he's making, all it is it's a different expression of the divine in the most clear and obvious way, right? It's just the divine speech. That's all it is. There's no separate being of a frog or an elephant. There's just the process of creation, right? As we've discussed at great length in earlier chapters, right? So the only thing that is here is a divine expression. The very same act that is doing that, and from which nothing can be created because nothing can be separated, right? That very same act is the act by which he totally conceals himself and creates something separate from him, right? We've already said that this is something which cannot be understood, right? You can't understand how this is literally two literal opposites in the same place. It's not an act of gvura that's inspired by chesed. It's an act of chesed gvura, right? It's one act of chesed gvura, right? It's one act of both things. So when the Alter Rebbe is saying that the gvura, that the divine self-concealment, right, is part of the act of the divine revelation, we must make sure not to think of it in too worldly a term. We're not talking about the worldly act in which a father needs to discipline his child with love. Right? We're talking about an act that is literally two opposites in one act. It is the act of creation and uncreation. It's the act of making something and making nothing, right? It's the act of self-revelation and self-concealment. Simultaneously, it is the very act which is revealing him is the act which is concealing him. Yes? This is something that is only by God. What does that mean? Oh, I should mention, by the way, I made a note here to mention it, so I remembered. I should mention that when we discuss in Chassidus the different klipot, right, the different powers that are enemies of godliness, right, which conceal godliness within the world, right, which none of this that we're discussing is really about klipot. Klipot are like a special case, things which actually conceal godliness, because as it should be clear, Elokim does not actually conceal godliness. Elokim is an act of divine revelation, together with an act of divine concealment, right? It's this paradox that we've been discussing. Right? That's really what Elokim is. Klippa is a whole different level of Elokim. It's for a different time, a different discussion. Things which are actually opposed to godliness, right? Rather than simply opposed to godliness by existing, right? We're discussing things that apparently oppose godliness just by existing, by being an independent reality. A Klippa is something that doesn't just exist, but is actively concealing God, right? Whatever, that was just a side note for those that are interested. When you talk about things which actually oppose the forces of evil, the forces of the concealment of God within the world, right? They all have names, and all the names come from the Torah. There's 7 main ones, right? These are the 7 Canaanite nations that dwelled in Israel when the Jews conquered it, right? Which we read every day, right? The Kanani and the Knizi and the Gervi. Yeah. So that whole chevra, right? The whole crowd. These are klippas, not a great chevra, but
Not a good chevra, no.
these nations, right? These nations are names of 7 klippas. They're the 7 klippas corresponding, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, to Zon Malchus, right? The 6 emotive qualities, and Malchus, the quality of majesty or kingship, the 7 lower spheres, right? The 7 lower modes of divine expression each have a klippa, which is their obverse, their negative effect, right? So you can have a kindness of holy, you can have a holy kindness and an unholy kindness, right? You can have a holy severity or a holy discipline and an unholy discipline, right? All these 7 nations. What is it that defeats these klippas, right? What defeats them? There's Gilui Elokus. They are enemies of the Jewish people. If you reveal godliness, then they disappear. They melt away like darkness in front of light. Right? They don't have any reality of their own. If you reveal godliness, which within the human being, this means that the person reconnects their soul to God during prayer every day, then this act of experiencing godliness, of experiencing the light of God, and the soul uniting with godliness, this naturally drives away these negative character traits. There are only, as far as I'm aware, 2 exceptions. There's 2 exceptions to this rule, right? There's Amalek, which is a different klippa. Amalek is Yedeas Rebbeinu Mechaven Limrud Bey, right? Amalek knows the king, but he rebels anyway, which is why he's the recurring enemy. There's no way to defeat Amalek, right? Because Amalek knows God, he sees God, he knows that God exists. He's frummer than you are, right? And still he rebels against God, right? Which is what makes Amalek so special, right? Amalek is a different discussion for a different time. And there's a separate klipa, which is known as Midian. Midian is also not defeated by the revelation of God. It says later, much later in the Torah than what we're reading now, I believe in Parshas Matos Mase, maybe? Somewhere over there. I can't remember exactly. You have to forgive me. It says that you must revenge the vengeance of God, of Shem Havaya, against the Midianites, right? And the famous question is, a revenge of God, right? It should be a revenge of the Jewish people. Who did the Midianites hurt? The Midianites came and they hurt the Jewish people, right? The whole story, right? The whole story, Balak, Bilam, right? The princess, Pinchas, that whole Maisa, right? Midian attacked the Jewish people. So why does it say the vengeance of God? And explained in Chassidus that Midian, what's the klipa of Midian? What's the evil nature of Midian? Midian is disunity itself. Madain miloshen madain umeriva. Right? Midian comes from the term that means disunity, fighting among people, disunity among people, right? And explains in Chassidus that disunity itself is the enemy of Havaya. That's the enemy of God himself. It's not a normal klipa. It's not a normal bad character trait, which it knows about God and then it disappears. Right? This is a bad character trait. This is an evil, right? Which is literally the prime enemy of godliness. Godliness is unity, is the point. The point is that godliness in Chassidus, right? Godliness, very good. Hechaltzu in Ranat. The godliness in Chassidus is synonymous with unity. Things being unified, things being together. Midian, the klipa, which is disunity, is the klipa which is opposed to Shem Havaya itself. Right? So in other words, this whole idea that Gvura and Chesed can come together, even though they're absolute opposites, is only by God. This is, in fact, the uniquely divine trait. The most divine thing is two opposites able to exist together. Unity. It says the signature of God, the seal of God is emes, is truth, right? Truth is the same idea. What is the truth? Truth is Aleph Mem Sav, right? It's the Mreach HaTichon. It's the middle road. It's the thing which is consistent from the beginning to the end, right? The truth is that which unites all things. The truth is that which runs from the beginning of the Aleph Beis to the end of the Aleph Beis, and it's the same throughout. The truth unites all things together, right? God, his trait is unity. His seal is truth, and his trait is unity above all. Therefore, when we see that Chesed and Gvura are united in one act, even though they are truly two opposite things, we know that this act is divine, and the Chesed and the Gvura are God's Chesed and Gvura. This is God's self-revelation and God's concealment, because only God could unite these two opposites into one act. Therefore, our question is answered. The Gvura does not need a Gvura, right? The divine severity does not need a further severity to limit it, right? Because what we're talking about are not pure kindness and pure severity as we would understand them in the world, right? Where in their purest form, each one denies the other, right? On the contrary, what we're saying is the very fact that they don't deny each other, the very fact that they're able to unify, even though they're absolute opposites, that is the sign of their infinitude. What is infinite, right? What is endless, what is without end about the Gvura is not that it is a pure, infinite concealment of God. What's infinite about the Gvura is that every place that the Chesed is, the Gvura is also. Again, the question was, if God's severity and self-limitation is infinite, then it should be one infinite self-concealment at one level. Where does all the diversity come from? Right? You know what the answer is? The answer is that the way that God's severity is infinite is in a way of revelation. How is it infinite? It's infinite because everywhere that he is revealed, he is also concealed. At every one of the infinite acts of creation that he is doing through kindness, his severity is there to limit that act of creation. It is not infinite in the sense that it makes that it has no connection with his revelation, right? That it's an absolute concealment of his revelation. That's not what Gvura is. What Gvura is it works together with his revelation. That's what Shem Elokim is, right? In that one act. How is it infinite? It's infinite in the exact same way the Chesed is infinite. The same way Chesed creates an infinite number of realities, an infinite number of things, so too Gvura at every level, his self-concealment at every level, is concealing at every one of those points. Oh wow, we're way over time. Yeah.
Is severity really the right word?
Nobody complained.
I don't know. It's the usual translation.
I mean, it could, well, I had looked at some other translations.
Yeah, I keep saying self-concealment, judgment.
I was thinking, just from a search.
Yeah.
Discipline.
Discipline. Yeah, I mentioned discipline earlier today.
Severity implies something else.
Right, has different connotations in English, right? The point is that we're talking about the divine self-concealment. None of those terms is actually the correct. It's not discipline either, right? Self-discipline, maybe. The divine self-discipline, I guess you could say, right? Sure. The divine self-concealment. It does not imply, you're right, it does not have a connotation of severity like a human severity does necessarily. Sometimes it does, in some contexts it does, but in our context it does not. Let's read a little further, since we're so over time, right? This is all bets are off. Who knows how long we'll be here? No, I'm joking. There's five more minutes, if you'll let me. Let's read at the bottom of page 897. Al wanted to know what the source was for this whole teaching, right? Bottom of 897. Kamaimer Eliyahu. Yes? Yeah, 5 more minutes. Kamaimer Eliyahu. As Eliyahu said, as Elijah said, as we read this on Erev Shabbos, right? In the Tekutah Zohar. Everything in life you need to know is in this is in Pasach Eliyahu that we read on Erev Shabbos in the Siddur. More or less. Yeah, if you know what it means is the trick, right? So what Eliyahu says is as follows. Va'antu de kasher lein umeyachid lein. He is the one who connects them and unites them, right? In other words, these traits, kindness and self-concealment, the self-revelation and self-concealment, right, are united and put together by God. Only God can make these two opposites united. V'chulu, etc. And then it says, Uvar minach leis yechuda be'ilai. Aside from you, God, there is no unity among those attributes above. Right? It is only because they are one with God. It is only inasmuch as they are divine that they are able to unite. It is only because of God's presence, the infinite power of God, to combine absolute opposites, that these two things are combined into the one divine act. And this, by understanding this idea, that it is in their unity that these things are absolutely divine and absolutely united with God, we are thereby prepared for next week's class, God willing, in which the Alter Rebbe will bring it all back home and we will return back to what we were discussing on the very first page of this book. We're going to bring it all back to the beginning. Things are coming to a head, as they would say. Right? Things are. The Alter Rebbe is culminating his whole line of thought here in chapter 6, as we will see, if God willing, next week.